On June 19, 1944, during the third year of World War II's Pacific Campaign, Japanese naval aviators climbed into their cockpits in the skies above the Philippine Sea, expecting another desperate but honorable battle against the Americans, who had been pushing westward across the Pacific since the war began in December 1941. What they encountered instead was something far worse than they could have imagined, a technological mismatch so severe and a slaughter so complete that those who survived would carry the horror of that day for the rest of their lives. This was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and it would go down in World War II history by a nickname that captured its brutal one-sidedness: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese pilots flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the fighter that had once ruled Pacific skies with its incredible agility and range, this battle marked their first mass encounter with an American fighter that had been specifically designed to kill them, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. What unfolded over 2 days in June would not just be a defeat, but a catastrophe so total that it effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct carrier air operations for the remainder of World War II. To understand the sheer scale of the disaster that befell Japanese naval aviation on that summer day, you have to go back to the beginning of the Pacific War and see how far Japan had fallen in just 2.5 years. In December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, bringing the United States into World War II, the men flying those planes were among the most experienced and well-trained combat aviators in the world. Many had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time over China, where Japan had been waging war since 1937, honing their skills in actual combat. The Zero fighter they flew was superior to almost everything the Americans could put in the air at that time. It could turn tighter than any Allied fighter, had exceptional range that allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was absolutely deadly. American pilots in the early months of the war learned quickly that trying to dogfight a Zero in a turning battle was often fatal. The Japanese carrier air groups that struck Pearl Harbor and then rampaged across the Pacific in early 1942, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, were elite formations, professional warriors who had trained together for years and knew their aircraft inside and out. But war grinds down even the best, and Japan faced a fundamental problem that would prove fatal. Unlike the United States, which had the industrial capacity and training infrastructure to replace losses many times over, Japan could not easily replace either its aircraft or, more critically, its highly trained pilots. When experienced aviators died in combat, they took years of irreplaceable training and combat knowledge with them. The Japanese training system was rigorous but slow, designed to produce a small number of elite pilots rather than a large number of competent ones. This worked fine in peacetime or in a short war, but the Pacific War was neither short nor kind to aviators on either side. Every major carrier battle from Coral Sea in May 1942 through Midway a month later, and then the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, bled away Japan's core of experienced pilots. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, cost Japan many veteran aircrew. Midway in June 1942 was even worse, taking not just 4 fleet carriers, but many of the skilled pilots and crew who had attacked Pearl Harbor. Then came Guadalcanal and the surrounding waters, a 6-month meat grinder from August 1942 to February 1943, where Japanese naval aircraft flew from carriers and land bases in a sustained campaign that devoured air groups whole. American pilots called those waters Iron Bottom Sound because of all the ships on the ocean floor, but the sky above was just as much a graveyard. By mid-1944, Japan's naval aviation was a shadow of what it had been. The veteran pilots who survived were spread thin, trying to train new recruits who had perhaps a quarter of the flight hours that pre-war pilots had received. Many of the young men climbing into cockpits in June 1944 had barely 100 hours of total flight time, and much of that was basic training. They had little gunnery practice because Japan was short on fuel and ammunition for training. They had almost no combat experience because there were few veterans left to mentor them and no safe areas to gradually introduce them to combat. These young pilots were being thrown directly into battle against American aviators who by now had developed their own body of combat experience and, critically, had been trained in large numbers by an industrial system that could afford to be generous with fuel and practice ammunition. The Japanese were sending up boys to fight men, and they were sending them up in an aircraft that, while still agile, was fundamentally outmatched by what the Americans were now flying. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was not an accident. It was a deliberate response to the Zero, designed using hard-won lessons from the first year of the Pacific War. When Grumman engineers sat down to create a successor to their earlier F4F Wildcat, they had access to detailed combat reports and, critically, to an intact Zero that had crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands in June 1942 and been recovered mostly undamaged. American engineers could study their enemy in detail, understand its strengths and weaknesses, and build something to exploit those weaknesses while negating those strengths. The Hellcat that emerged was in many ways the opposite of the Zero, where the Zero was light and agile but fragile, built to maximize performance by minimizing weight. The Hellcat was rugged and heavy, built like a tank with armor plate protecting the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that would not explode when hit, and a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that gave it power the Zero could only dream of. It was not as maneuverable in a slow-speed turning fight, but it did not need to be. The Hellcat was faster in level flight, and especially in a dive, it could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying, and it was armed with 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns that could tear an enemy aircraft apart in a short burst. American doctrine evolved alongside the aircraft. Pilots were trained not to dogfight with Zeros on Japanese terms, but to use the Hellcat's advantages in speed and ruggedness. They would attack from above, diving through enemy formations with superior speed, firing quick bursts, and then using their momentum to climb back to altitude before the Zeros could respond. If a Zero got on their tail, they would not try to turn with it but would dive away, using their superior speed to escape, then climb back up for another pass. They fought in pairs, with wingmen protecting each other, and they used their radios extensively to coordinate attacks. This was systematic, disciplined aerial combat that treated fighter operations almost like a science. The Japanese, meanwhile, were still trying to teach their inexperienced pilots the old methods that had worked in 1941, but without the skill or the numbers to make those methods effective anymore. The stage for the catastrophe was set by Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, who saw the American invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands as a crisis that demanded action. The Marianas were considered part of Japan's inner defensive ring, crucial territory about 1,300 miles from Tokyo. They were close enough to the Japanese home islands that American B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from there could strike Japan itself. Toyoda ordered the Mobile Fleet, Japan's remaining carrier strike force, to sortie and destroy the American invasion fleet. It would be Japan's first major carrier battle since the costly engagement off the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the operation, and he had some advantages on paper. His 9 carriers held roughly 470 aircraft, and he knew his planes had longer range than American carrier aircraft, which meant he could theoretically strike the Americans from a distance while staying outside the range of American counterattacks. But those advantages were more theoretical than real, because the quality of his aircrew was so poor and because the Americans had something Japan did not: radar and a massive numerical advantage. The American Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance was protecting the Saipan invasion, and Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was the shield. Mitcher had 15 carriers, 7 of them large fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, embarking more than 900 aircraft. His pilots were well trained, many of them veterans, flying aircraft that included nearly 500 Hellcats. The Americans also had radar-equipped ships and aircraft that could detect incoming raids while they were still far away, providing enough warning to get fighters airborne and positioned to intercept. The Japanese had no such early warning capability. When they launched their strikes, they were essentially flying blind into a buzzsaw. June 19, 1944 dawned clear over the Philippine Sea. Ozawa launched his first strike early in the morning, sending out 69 aircraft toward the American fleet. What those pilots did not know was that American radar had detected them over 100 miles away. Fighter direction officers on the American ships watched the blips on their radar screens and calmly vectored Hellcats into intercept positions. The Japanese formation flew onward, expecting perhaps to achieve some element of surprise, but instead they flew directly into a wall of Hellcats that had been waiting for them at the perfect altitude and position. Survivors of that first strike later described the horror of seeing the Hellcats appear seemingly from nowhere, dozens of them, and then the formations beginning to shred apart as the big American fighters tore through them. The Hellcats did not dance and weave like Zeros would have done. They attacked with brutal efficiency, making high-speed passes, firing their 6 machine guns in concentrated bursts that could saw wings off or explode fuel tanks, and then climbing away before the surviving Zeros could react. The Zero pilots tried to fight back, tried to use their superior maneuverability to get behind the Hellcats, but the Americans would not play that game. If a Zero got close, the Hellcat would simply dive away, using its superior speed and power, and by the time the Zero could react, the Hellcat was already climbing back to altitude. Some Japanese pilots managed to get hits on Hellcats, raking them with their lighter machine guns and 20mm cannon, but to their horror, many of those Hellcats just kept flying. The armor and self-sealing tanks worked. Hellcats that would have been flaming wrecks if they were Zeros instead shrugged off the damage and kept fighting. Japanese pilots began calling the Hellcat a flying tank, and the nickname was not a compliment, but a term of horror. It was a tank that could fly and that could kill you, but that you seemingly could not kill in return. That first strike lost 42 of its 69 aircraft without achieving anything meaningful. Some planes jettisoned their bombs just to try to survive and flee. Only a handful made it through the fighter screen to attack the American ships, and they accomplished almost nothing. Back on the Japanese carriers, the news was incomprehensible. How could so many aircraft simply vanish? But there was no time to process the disaster because Ozawa, not knowing the full extent of what had happened and still believing in the plan, launched a second strike. This time he sent up 128 aircraft. They flew east toward the American fleet, and once again American radar saw them coming from far away. Once again Hellcats were vectored into perfect intercept positions. Once again the Japanese formations flew into an ambush. The killing was even worse this time because the Americans were now fully warmed up and the sky was full of Hellcats. Japanese pilots later described flying into what looked like a cloud of American fighters, and then that cloud descended on them and everything became chaos and fire. Zeros exploded, Aichi D-3A dive bombers and Nakajima B-6N torpedo planes were swatted from the sky before they ever got close to a target, and the few that pressed on toward the American ships ran into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from the fleet below. American ships had massed their formations into defensive groups bristling with guns, and they had practiced their anti-aircraft drills endlessly. The sky over the American fleet was laced with tracers and exploding shells. It was death from above in the form of Hellcats and death from below in the form of ship guns, and the Japanese aircraft caught between were annihilated. Of that second strike of 128 planes, 97 were destroyed. Only 31 returned to their carriers, and many of those were damaged. Ozawa launched 2 more strikes that day, throwing everything he had at the Americans in a desperate attempt to achieve something, anything. The third raid of 47 planes lost 7 aircraft and accomplished nothing. The fourth raid of 82 planes ran into a combination of Hellcats, bad navigation, and fuel exhaustion. Many of the surviving pilots were so inexperienced and so rattled that they could not find their way back to their carriers. Some ditched in the ocean, some tried to land at Guam where they thought there were friendly airfields. only to find that American Hellcats were already patrolling there and shot them down. Others simply ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea. By the end of June 19th, Ozawa's carrier air groups had been gutted. He had started the day with about 470 aircraft. By nightfall, he had fewer than 100 left that were operational. The Americans had lost 29 aircraft in combat that day. The pilots who survived and made it back to the Japanese carriers were broken men. They reported things that seemed impossible: American fighters everywhere, in overwhelming numbers, and seemingly unkillable. They described how their formations had been shredded, how planes around them had simply exploded or caught fire and tumbled from the sky. They talked about hitting Hellcats and seeing the bullets strike home, but the Hellcats just kept coming, kept attacking, kept killing. Some pilots wept. Others sat in silence, unable to process what they had experienced. The Zero, which had been their shield and sword for so many years, had failed them utterly. It was not that the Zero had become a bad aircraft. It was that the war had moved on and left it behind, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce something better in sufficient numbers. The Hellcat represented everything Japan could not match: overwhelming production, technological sophistication, advanced tactics, well-trained pilots, and support systems like radar and fighter direction that turned aerial combat from a series of individual duels into a coordinated slaughter. June 20th brought no respite. American scout planes found the Japanese fleet, and Mitcher launched a massive strike late in the afternoon, knowing his pilots would have to return in darkness, which was dangerous, but also knowing this might be the only chance to destroy Ozawa's carriers. That American strike caught the Japanese fleet and savaged it, sinking the fleet carrier Hiyo and damaging several others, along with destroying more Japanese aircraft. The carrier Shokaku had been sunk by an American submarine on June 19th, as had the newer carrier Taiho. The return flight was indeed harrowing, with many American planes running out of fuel and ditching in the ocean, but most of those pilots were rescued. For the Japanese, there was no recovery. The mobile fleet limped back to its bases, its air groups essentially destroyed as effective fighting units. The final tally was staggering, and remains one of the most lopsided battles in naval aviation history. Japan lost approximately 645 aircraft over the 2 days of battle, along with 3 fleet carriers. The Americans lost 123 aircraft, and many of those losses were operational accidents rather than combat, with planes ditching due to fuel exhaustion during night landings. More importantly for Japan, the pilots who had been lost could not be replaced. Japan's carrier air arm, already weakened by years of attrition, was finished as an offensive force. The few carriers that survived would never again operate as a coherent strike force. Some would be used as decoys in later battles, like the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Most would simply sit in port because there were no trained pilots to fly from them, and no way to train new ones fast enough to matter. For the Americans, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was validation. The Hellcat worked exactly as designed, the tactics worked, the coordination between radar, fighter direction, and the pilots worked. It was systematic destruction, industrial warfare applied to aerial combat. The Marianas Turkey Shoot nickname, coined by American pilots who likened the easy kills to shooting turkeys, captured the one-sided nature perfectly, though that nickname also hid the professionalism and skill that had made it possible. The battle also marked a turning point in the Pacific War's momentum. With Japan's carrier aviation destroyed, the United States had complete freedom of action at sea. The invasion of the Philippines could proceed. The advance toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa could proceed. Eventually, the strategic bombing of Japan itself could proceed, because Japan no longer had the naval air power to effectively challenge American operations. The war would continue for another year, and it would be bloody, with battles like Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa from April to June 1945, costing tens of thousands of lives, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan's defensive perimeter was broken, and there was no way to restore it. What made the Battle of the Philippine Sea particularly tragic from the Japanese perspective was that it was so foreseeable. By June 1944, Japan's leadership knew their pilot training program was producing inadequate aviators. They knew the Hellcat was superior to the Zero in most combat situations. They knew American industry was producing aircraft and training pilots at rates Japan could never match. Yet they sent those young pilots out anyway, believing that fighting spirit and tactical surprise might overcome material disadvantages, or perhaps simply because they had no other options. Japanese strategic doctrine had gambled on a short war that would be decided quickly before American industrial might could be brought to bear. That gamble had failed at Midway in June 1942, but Japan fought on, bleeding away resources and lives in battles it could not win. The Philippine Sea was where that accumulated failure became impossible to ignore. The Hellcat itself became legendary, credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter type in World War II. By the war's end in August 1945, Hellcats had shot down more than 5,000 Japanese aircraft, a staggering tally that reflected both the quality of the aircraft and the skill of the pilots who flew it. The Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of 19-1, meaning for every Hellcat lost in air combat, 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. But more than that, the Hellcat represented a particular American approach to warfare: identifying a problem, engineering a solution, producing that solution in vast quantities, and training people to use it effectively. Where Japan relied on the warrior spirit of its pilots to overcome material disadvantages, America built material advantages so overwhelming that spirit alone could not prevail. For the Zero pilots who survived the Turkey Shoot, the remaining months of World War II were a long nightmare. They would fly more missions, face more Hellcats, and watch more comrades die. Some would eventually die themselves, either in conventional combat or in the kamikaze suicide attacks that Japan resorted to when conventional tactics had failed completely. The first organized kamikaze units were formed just 4 months later, in October 1944, a testament to how desperate Japan's situation had become. Others survived to the war's end and had to live with the memories of everything they had seen and lost. In their accounts, one theme appears repeatedly: the horror of that day in June when they first encountered the Hellcat in large numbers and realized they were fighting an enemy they could not defeat. It was not just that they lost a battle, it was that they lost hope, confronted with the reality that their training, their aircraft, and their tactics were all inadequate against what America had built. The Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of the most one-sided engagements in World War II naval aviation history, a testament to what happens when technological superiority, tactical doctrine, training quality, and sheer numbers all align on one side. For Japan, it was the end of the dream of controlling the Pacific through carrier aviation. For the United States, it was proof that the strategy of overwhelming force applied with precision worked. And for the men who fought there, on both sides, it was a day that defined the rest of their lives, remembered in triumph by some and in horror by others. The Hellcat had done exactly what it was designed to do, and the Zero pilots who faced it would indeed never forget what that horror felt like.